All right, everybody, we are back. Oh, I am Jack Murphy, and this is Jack Murphy Live. We have got today somebody I've been trying to talk to actually for the better part of a year. I really appreciate him taking the time to come on. His name is Eric Kaufmann. He is a professor of politics at the University of London. He's the author of a book called White Shift. Everybody should get it. It is right here, White Shift. He is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and at CSPI. He's written an article recently that has been making the rounds about the association or relationship, rather, of LGBTQ identity and politics and mental health. Some of the questions we're going to get to today are we all going to end up gay? Are people getting crazy and then becoming gay? Is being gay making them crazy? Is there a relationship between politics and sexuality? Is LGBTQ a political affiliation now more so than a sexual orientation? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about populism, immigration, demographics, the future of white majorities in America and elsewhere. Lots of important stuff. Here's the book one more time, White Shift. Go out and get one. And here we go. Eric, how are you doing, sir?
Good to be here, Jack. Thanks a lot for having me. And I too have been waiting for quite a while.
Yeah, it's awesome, man. I appreciate your patience in getting some of these things rescheduled. Both very busy guys. But I think that we've got a good time right now. You just had a new piece come out that was very interesting. And one thing that I really love about your work is that it is not just opinion articles. It's not just an op-ed column, but there is a tremendous amount of research and empirical data that goes into your analysis. And before we get into the actual content, I just want to set the stage for people so that they understand who we're talking to and why it's important. Eric, if you could just introduce yourself just a little bit to us, and then I do want to talk about your methods so that when we do talk about some of these rather controversial issues and things that really have stirred the pot, and things that can also be used by either group to really rouse people up, get people excited, whether you're on the right, whether you're on the left. There's something to make you mad, probably, for anybody here within your work. So let's talk about who you are and your work really quickly so that we can really have some confidence that we're not just talking out of our ass here.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a professor here in London, England, even though I'm Canadian. And as you can tell, I don't sound British. But I've lived here for a long time, and my interests have very much been around the question of national identities, but particularly ethnic majority identities, the largest ethnic group within a country like white American or white British. Those groups have been understudied, or they've sort of been ignored in many ways. So that's one thing. And I've also been interested in the impact of demographic shifts, such as immigration, such as population aging, how that affects politics. And so when we come to talk about something like national populism and polarization, I'd be interested in, how are the kind of ethnic shifts that are happening across the West reverberating through politics and affecting politics? And how are they affecting people's national identity as American or British and so on? So that's kind of the core of what I've been studying for probably over 20, 25 years. Now, I have had a few detours. I've looked at religion a little bit, and this recent work I've done on LGBT is somewhat of an offshoot as well. It's somewhat away from my core business to some degree. But in terms of methods, I believe very much in kind of the scientific method and not just sort of making ideological statements. So I think it's very important to bring particularly large data sets based on large surveys, not just one person I interviewed or a focus group, but thousands of people. That just allows you to iron out, get past the outliers and look at what the signal is more than the noise. So I put a lot of stock in survey data and quantitative evidence rather than simply qualitative interview based.
Excellent. So you're looking at large data sets, both in the United States and in Europe and other countries as well, too. So you're seeing a mix of things. And it's not just who you were able to grab off the internet to interview.
Yeah, exactly. Because, vivid stories make a big impression. We need those vivid stories. They're great, but they can distort very easily. Impressions can very easily be misleading. So it's really important, I think, to try and get at as representative a sample, as large a sample as you can.
Well, remember I told you before the show that I've got a bunch of notes and I have an outline, but as soon as I ask one question, that all goes out the window. I immediately have a follow-up question on something you said where you said that the traditional ethnic majorities are understudied.
Yeah.
That struck me as curious. Because I can just hear, a critical person saying, well, all of our history and study has been based off of our ethnic majority. What do you mean they've been understudied, sir?
So what I mean is, is the ethnic majorities as ethnic majorities. So yes, there's been a big study of English, let's say British history, American history. But if people look at British history, they will be talking about the nation of Britain, but they won't be talking about, let us say, the ethnic English as a group within the nation of Britain. So the attention has always been just to the nation, which has always kind of been assumed to be the same thing, more or less, as the ethnic majority. And in many cases, that's kind of correct. It's been such a close relationship through much of history, especially in Europe, that you haven't really needed to have this separate category. But now, increasingly, as you get a larger ethnic minority population, which by the end of the century in Europe and by mid-century in North America will be a majority, the ethnic majority as a category becomes a lot more distinct and deserving of more attention in its own right. So that's kind of what I would say. Now, of course, you are right that the critical side has very much talked a lot about whiteness and white this and white that. What I would say there is that their approach is a very much oppositional political one. So they're not particularly interested in the ethnic majority as another ethnic community alongside Hispanic Americans and Chinese Americans, to be studied with interest and sympathy, but rather just as this sort of kind of a whipping boy to be sort of opposed to the interests of minority groups. And also, so you've got these two things going on, and that's sort of skewed the entire enterprise in terms of understanding what's going on.
Yeah. Can you foresee an instance in which a major university opens up a center for white American studies?
Well, only as for critical white studies,
Oh,
not
right.
for. Yeah, you have, and it's funny because I remember a book called Critical White Studies, which came out in 1998. One of the authors was a key figure in the development of critical race theory, and at the time, I thought this was really exciting. Hey, people are starting to look at ethnic majorities. But pretty quickly, I reviewed that book. That tells you how old I am in 1998, and sort of wasn't that positive on it. But partly because there was just an inability to treat this group as a group like any other. Instead, it has to be the backdrop, the demon, etc. So yeah, no, I don't think in the current climate that's possible, really, to have a kind of dispassionate. I mean, maybe a very brave figure who could withstand a lot of brickbats.
Well, since we're on this subject, we might as well just go right to it, and we can do the LGBTQ part on the second half. Uh, your book, White Shift, is a deep dive into the changing nature of the demographics in the West and in the United States. And, as I'm reading it, I want to ask you a question. It's kind of trolly, but kind of not, and it's on topic, for our national conversation here in the United States. You know, uh, is the Great Replacement theory real? And if so, what does it mean? Can it be stopped? Should it be stopped? Is it a real thing? I mean, people could be reading your book from one person. It's very neutral, right? In many regards, it's not going to, people on both sides can use it as a way to look at things. So this question is a little bit trolly, but I mean,
Yeah,
is it? What is
yeah, it's a
happening
good.
demographically speaking in that regard?
Yeah, it's a really good question and entry point because that term means a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing we can establish is ethnic change is happening, and that's not a controversial point. So we've known for a long time that around about 2050, Um, the ethnic majority will fall below 50% in the United States. Now, we can quibble about who counts as white, where the boundary is between Hispanic and white, and that's a very important debate. But around 2050 in Canada, the US, and New Zealand, we're going to go towards that majority minority so called position. And that'll happen at the end of the century in the main immigrant receiving Western European countries, roughly speaking, based on current population forecasts. Yeah, the first thing to say is there is a transformation occurring. Now, the term replacement. Okay, so the term replacement has been used in geography and in demography as a standard academic term for many years. It is not a controversial term until perhaps very, very recently. So there are plenty of demographers who talk about one population replacing another. It might be Turks replacing Greeks in present day Turkey or something like that. So that too, I don't think is particularly controversial that you can have population replacement over time. Um, and what's interesting is both the right and the left. Obviously, the left will talk about the browning of America. They'll talk about demographic change and how this is going to change the electoral map, the coming Democratic majority. There's a whole Michael Moore when the U.S. Census results came out saying that whites had declined for the first time in American history. Said this is the greatest day in American history. Now, so you obviously have a left wing, call it a great replacement narrative going on the left. You have obviously got one on the right. The question then becomes, what do they actually mean by this? If they mean that white majorities are becoming a minority and are going to be replaced as a percentage of the population by other groups, I think that's not particularly controversial. If the argument is, well, there is a cabal of people who are pushing for this replacement, trying to make whites extinct and perform white genocide, I think that is a conspiracy theory. But of course, you've got different shades. So what you see is, as the population is shifting, many on the left are celebrating this as, like Michael Moore, as something that's going to lead to a more kind of left-dominated liberal society. So they are riding the horse. But what I would say is that they didn't actually plan it. So if you go back to 1965, the U.S., the opening up of the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, people like Bobby Kennedy on the Democrat side were saying this won't change the ethnic composition. And I am convinced from everything I've seen, they kind of believe that nowhere in the background were they saying, well, we're going to say it's not going to change the composition, but we really know it will, and we really want to get rid of WASPs or white people. So I don't think there was any orchestrated plan. Yeah.
Can I stop you right there?
Yeah.
Excellent place to drill down.
Okay.
So I have tweeted in the past that either we're living a great lie or a giant mistake, but either way, the outcome was unintended. And I think it's worth exploring this notion because, look, a mistake is one thing. A lie is a totally different thing altogether. And especially when the ramifications are the radical transformation of the ethnic makeup in the United States. I am no friend to the hard right, to the alt right. Those guys all hate me. It's fine. But they have taught me a couple of things, right? Like, as being raised in liberal America in a blue state, being a Democratic voter up until 2016 with Donald Trump, I always believed in, or didn't even really understand like how white and how Christian America really was up until 1965. And I went back and I looked at the stats because they throw them in my face, these alt-right guys, all the time. And holy cow, I mean, like 90% white Christian all the way up until like 1965. And then it totally changes. And now within 100 years, it's going to be, as you say, the whites will no longer be the majority. They will say, the hard right guys, that it was a specific, misleading, deliberate plan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I can see when you look at the actions and the outcomes of the decision to change away from, certain immigration from certain countries and spreading it out amongst a whole wide array of countries, that you could easily be persuaded that it was deliberate. Have you done investigation into contemporaneous letters, journals, conversations, whatever? Like, what research have you done which leads you to believe with that the statement that you just made previously, which is that Kennedy, there was no indication on your that you could see that Kennedy like knew what he was doing and it was going to totally disrupt America. And what he said about it not changing the demographics of the United States was an honest statement that he made at that time rather than a lie and what seems to be just an error.
Yeah, I mean, this is based a lot on historians who've looked at the sort of congressional record, who've looked at statements. And what you can see is quite interesting because, the left was trying to remove, they had what was called the National Origins Quota System, the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, amended in 29, which sort of more or less established quotas for each country, which were roughly proportionate to their share in the population. So Britain had about half the quota, for example. Ireland had a large quota. Now, they were trying to argue against dismantling those quotas beginning in the 50s. If you look at Harry Truman, you look at the arguments he was making, it was all about this makes us look bad. We've got exclusions. It says neither Jew nor Greek in the Bible. It says all men are. So the logic behind the people who were trying to get rid of the quotas was entirely about the present and about morality. It's all about, well, we can't discriminate. There was no sense like, well, we want to engineer a new population. I almost think someone like a Truman would love to have been able to dismantle all of these quotas and yet the country to remain as it was. I kind of think a lot of those people would have been comfortable with that. But of course, it doesn't happen that way because there's such a thing as global push and pull on migration. And similarly with the Kennedy thing, I mean, if you look at the logic, it was all about optics to either liberal pluralist intellectuals or to certain ethnic minorities, at that time, Jewish, Italian, other non-WASP groups who identified as being kind of put upon by the WASP majority. It was in that context that the reforms were undertaken, right? Similarly, with removal of the ban on Chinese and Japanese immigration, 1948, I think the removal of that ban was largely, again, about dealing with Japan and about foreign policy with Japan. So you have these kind of very short-termist motivations in terms of immigration reform. It's not really guided by a vision of what the country's going to look like in 30, 50. So nowhere have I ever seen any sort of vision propounded of that, except perhaps by some radical intellectuals who didn't really have a lot of power. So yeah, I'm not convinced there was any long-term plan other than they didn't want to violate their a sort of universalist cosmopolitan moral system, which said you can't discriminate in terms of who you let in. That was what it was all about.
And there, right there, would be the spot that the hard right guys would hammer down: the universalist cosmopolitan sense that you can't discriminate. And that's an interesting concept because to be discriminating in life is generally meant as a compliment, right? Like you are someone who understands good and bad and things that you want and that you don't want, and you don't do dumb things and you don't hurt yourself and you don't hurt others. I mean, to be discriminating, to assess a value on your options is a good thing. But then when it comes to national immigration, it's somehow become a negative thing. And I think that those hard right guys would say that it's those universalist cosmopolitan intellectuals who you attributed to not having too much power who were actually influencing the narrative and making them feel like, oh, we need to uphold these appearances of not discriminating and therefore changing the lottery system around and opening the doors. I don't know that this is a debate that will be, or I don't even know if I'm debating it, an exploration that will be resolved at this point in time. But one final note I wanted to put on this in my sort of my learnings that nobody told me about when I went to all through high school, in college, a degree from a major university, a degree from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, master's degree. Never really talked about the fact that even is early back 1790 Immigration Naturalization Act. It has the word white right in there. So they were looking for like white men of good standing from Northern Europe. It's like right in the documents. So I had my eyes opened up to a lot of things that I wasn't privy to be totally honest. And now trying to just make sense of it. So I'm sort of in the camp of the toothpaste is out of the tube, guys. It's like, the events have taken place, the migration has taken place, the demographics have changed in such a way that now our task is to figure out, what to do with it. And so I guess that's partly into my next question here is there are answers of people. Sorry, there are people on the hard right who have their own answers of what should be done, and you bring up, the rise of like hardcore ethno traditionalists and ethnocentrists. Other people have other ideas. What are you seeing happen as a result, whatever the reasons or the causes, as a result of what's empirically obviously happening? What changes are we seeing in American and Western culture because of that?
Well, I mean, there's a lot there, but I think first thing is that the first thing, and it's interesting because we could have a debate about discrimination, which I think is really important, because I do think there's a very important distinction between a country and its relationship to the rest of the world, and in terms of how it selects members. A number of people would argue that's more similar to the way say, the Sons of Italy or the Knights of Columbus would select members from American society. In other words, you are permitted to discriminate if you have a voluntary association, just as you're permitted to discriminate if you want to choose a certain neighborhood or certain marriage partner of a certain ethnic background. That's not viewed as a horrible thing, right? But on the other hand, if you are running a bank and you're hiring people and you discriminate on the basis of ethnicity and race, that is, I think, rightly viewed as racial discrimination. So there's a very important distinction, say, between selecting members who you choose to associate with and who you can discriminate against when you're serving a public in a market or a government function. And there's quite an interesting paper, philosophy paper on this. So in a way, making distinctions in terms of who you allow into a country should not, in my view, be considered along exactly the same lines as the distinctions you make when hiring in a job, right? So, and that distinction is completely elided and obscured in the society, in the academia, in media, and so on. But it's a very important one, and we can't seem to get to that point where we can have that discussion.
So what you're saying, that's such a tell.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is,
Yeah.
which it's funny as an aside. So what you're saying became like a cognitive dissonance tell, when in the old days it used to be a sign of active listening. So here we go. I'm going to repeat back a little bit of what I think I just heard from you. The people that you permit to enter into your country are a voluntary association, wherein discrimination would be a reasonably applied tool. Whereas to whom you serve in the public sphere, whether it's a restaurant or a bank or whatever, discrimination applied there would be an inappropriate tool.
Right. With one caveat, which is that you want to, in order to treat people fairly, you'd want if you were to do a discrimination on some cultural basis, you'd want that to reflect an equal mix of the mix of cultures in your country, rather than favoring one group, right? So if you just admitted, people of English descent into America and everyone else was screened out, then that justifiably, and someone of, say, Italian or Chinese origin in America could rightly say, hey, we're not being treated fairly. So yes to that, but if you are doing an even reflection of what's in your country in terms of the criteria, then I don't think it's actually a violation of liberal principles. And again, there's a great article by Chris Wellman in Political Theory. It's a journal which talks about this argument. It's just an important argument. We can never have that kind of discussion. It's impossible to have that discussion with people, except at a very abstruse level. But it's an important. Eventually, we're going to have to probably have that discussion. But anyway, I want to just get into the second part of your question, which was really about what are the effects of these changes. And the effects really, I think, are driving polarization and populism across the West. Because really, when it comes down to it, and there's been a lot of work by people like Jonathan Haidt on this, we're not all wired the same way. There's a strong heritable psychological component to how we see the world. Some people see change as loss, they experience change as something that they've lost. They see difference as disorderly. And so there's a correlation between views on immigration and how messy your desk is, whether you prefer a dress code in a tennis tournament. You know, it's things you would never imagine to be correlated are correlated. Even the way do you like this pattern of dots on a screen that's kind of disorderly, or this pattern that's in nice, neat lines? And depending on how you're wired, you're going to then prefer one or the other. And so if you have an increasingly changing and diverse society, and you are ordered, or you're sort of wired to prefer that more orderly society, then there's a good chance that you're going to respond negatively. And so what we're seeing is that what this diversity does is it hits the population, it splits it between people who respond negatively to this diversity for very deep psychological reasons in many cases, and those who respond positively. And that the polarization is increasingly the basis of political divisions in the Western world. So in the U.S., you look at the class composition of the Republican voters and the Democrat voters. It's very similar. In Britain, Labour and the Conservatives used to be the Labour Party was the party of the workers. The Conservatives was the middle class. Now the class composition is identical in the two parties. Unthinkable as recently as about 2000. So this whole rise in diversity has upended the whole political map, and people who are the cultural issues like immigration, the culture war, these sorts of things have come up the agenda and are structuring the way people vote much more than the old just free markets versus government intervention, the old left-right divide. Less important.
Right. So what you're saying is, what I've heard here is that, and please stop me if I'm wrong, and I'm a fan of Jonathan Haidt's work for sure. Political parties are driven more. This is a question. More or the less or the same today by people's psychological makeup.
More. And yeah.
And these are psychological traits that are evenly distributed across the population, skew in different piles across the population.
It's sort of like a third. They're broken into thirds. So you have a third of the people who see change and difference as negative. Maybe a third or a little less that, well, maybe a third that would see it positively, and a third kind of in the middle. I mean, of course, these are then going to be configured a little bit by the cultural debates that are occurring and the learning. But you can't, one of the points that's made by political psychologists is you can't teach somebody out of their preference for order over diversity, for example. And in fact, the more you try and get them to try and sort of teach them or force them out of it, the more resistance you're going to get. This is Karen Stenner's work on the authoritarian dynamic. And this attempt to sort of talk all the time about change and diversity actually has a backfiring effect. And there have been a number of psychological studies that show that the more you emphasize difference and change to certain kinds of voters, the more likely they are to support populists, for example. And so this is you have a left that is defined by diversity and change. That's those are the values that they think everyone should hold. And that's not the way the left used to be defined. The left used to be defined as, redistribution, the working class, helping the working class, protecting it. So as it's moved into identity politics and this idea of diversity and change, it's alienated a lot of voters who then shifted to the populist right.
Right. So you could, in the past, have been someone who appreciated order didn't appreciate change, had this psychological profile that you're describing, but also would have been, supportive of the left or unions or whatever it was in the past for the left. But today, what you're saying is that the party divisions are now being, and I can feel this, right, are now being split on either again on purpose or by accident. It's hard to say, psychologically speaking, and as a byproduct, perhaps, or as a goal of using the diversity and change mantra as the rallying cry for a political party, which then splits the country into psychologically distinct groups rather than people that have differences on policy opinions.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Um, that Pat. So let me give you a simple question. Um, should a child, is it more important for a child to be considerate or well mannered? Sounds like the same thing, but people's answer to that question, is it more important for a child to be considerate or well mannered, tells you way, way more about whether they will vote for Trump or Brexit than
Interesting.
their income or whether they've lost their job or any economic thing. So it's a deep-seated thing that people who will say well-mannered are more order-seeking, and they are invariably going to be more. And this is sort of one of the questions that psychologists have been asking for decades. But that's an example of a kind of question that will split the population
Right.
if you want to analyze voting today.
Wow. This to me seems to set a scenario in which propagandists and messengers and PR folks could have even heavier tools to divide us and instigate us into action than perhaps in the past. Class-based issues or rather policy-based issues. I think policy-based issues were the bedrock for people being able to be friends but have disagreements about politics. Whereas now, if you're going to use these psychological profiles as a way to hammer division and split and polarize people, that makes it less likely that you're going to be able to have perhaps I'm speculating here, a relationship that provides for differences in political opinion, which I seem to have noticed. I mean, I've experienced it personally that my own family, friends, of course, but family even too. As soon as it was known that I was voting for Trump after voting for Obama and Clinton and everybody, man, I haven't even heard from some of those people, since then. Like, no kidding, people that we were close to. Do you see any evidence that these are more powerful dividing forces than policy differences?
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. I would say you just look at core, like the kind of analysis I would do is I'd look at who voted for Trump out of 20,000 people. You know, how can I predict who of these 20,000 people voted for Trump? We have information on their income, on their attitudes to immigration, and all kinds of things. One of the best predictors is, of course, going to be attitudes to immigration. If you take white Americans amongst those who want less immigration in the country, something on the order of a 80% chance of having voted for Trump versus those who want a lot more immigration, it's sort of 1 out of 10 chance, right? So a massive, absolutely massive difference. Whereas if you take white Americans and you look at their income, there's essentially no difference between the richest and poorest in their likelihood of voting for Trump when you control for other things. So
Well,
it's
let's drill
almost
down
all
on
about,
that. Let's drill
yeah.
down on that. But people's reception to immigration is independent of their economic situation and more specifically dependent upon their psychological makeup.
Absolutely, yes. General research consensus, I would say, even in academia, is that your personal economics situation has very little to do with your immigration attitudes. Very, very little. It's much more rooted. Your attitude to the death penalty is way, way, way more connected to your views on immigration than anything economic. Um, Now, of course, it is the case that how you think the economy is going in the nation is connected, but that's a very partisan thing. So when Biden gets into office and you ask a Democrat how the economy is going, they're way more likely to say it's going well. And all the Republicans who were saying the economy is going well under Trump suddenly switched their answers. So it's a very misleading indicator, whereas the psychological stuff is pretty powerful.
Were
Yeah.
there others? Were there other? This is a political issue, but it's also, you're saying, a psychological issue. The immigration.
Yeah. Oh, I should say, all by the way, everything I've said about Trump holds equally for Brexit, almost entirely, the Brexit vote.
Right. Unsurprising there. The Well, at least to me, who lived it. um, have there been other issues in our past that were more psychologically construct driven rather than, on a deeper level than what appeared to have been a policy issue? Or is this a new
Yeah,
phenomenon?
I don't think it is a new phenomenon. And I think some people have argued, there have been, if you think of the 1960s and this sort of hippie movement, the student protests, all of that would be seen by certain voters as very disorderly. And I think would elicit a very similar reaction, right? So the reaction under Nixon, let's say, to the sort of 60s protests and all of that, I think would be another example. It might take a different form. So the narrative, the issues that are important at the time might be different ones. But what I would say is there's certain issues that bring this out more. So, for example, the fact that George W. Bush was talking a lot about religion and moral values did not seem to activate this psychological difference as much as the issue of, say, migration and ethnic change. That is, so Trump compared to Bush, Trump's emphasis is less on religion generally, and faith-based initiatives and all these sorts of 1980s and 90s issues, more on the question of the border and what's happening there. So I just think this immigration question is closer to some of these psychological predispositions than some of the other issues were in the past. But of course, you can go back, say, in American history to all the debates over immigration in the period from the 1890s to the 1920s, when it was a largely Protestant country with a growing Catholic population, and you had a similar response to what we're seeing now. I think that's a very similar, that's a historical parallel.
Mm-hmm. Mm. It's troubling. Sounds troubling to me. Deep political divisions based upon psychological makeup seems to be one that might be more, in my mind at least, a little bit more difficult to overcome or peacefully coexist with if the other side's policy prescription makes you crazy or whatever it is. How you respond to it psychologically.
Well, I think you could imagine, like, if you could imagine a situation where, let's say, the side that wants diversity and change accepted that some people want less diversity and less change, and accepted that as a valid way to be, right?
That's a
So,
big if.
I mean, I know that we're not in that world, but if we were in that world, you could imagine people saying, okay, some want faster immigration, some want slower. We're going to meet in the middle. And the people who want slower would understand they'd been heard, but that these other people want it faster, but that there's been a compromise. I think you could reach a compromise. And this is kind of one of the problems I have. And one of the things we are probably need to get into is the whole ideological shifts that have taken place on the left,
Mm.
which have led to a much more absolutist and intolerant viewed politically, and a sort of sacralization of race, gender, and sexuality. So that making these identity categories sacred means you can no longer negotiate on them. They're non-negotiable. There's no debate. That's probably one of the biggest sources of this polarization as well, is the inability of the progressive side to understand that actually this is a perfectly valid issue that people can have differences and disagreements on, and you need to reach a compromise on. So their view of the world is often, no, you're either open or you're closed. Whereas my view, I would say, is, well, there are people who want change faster and slower, right? And so if you accept that some people are on a continuum from fast to slow, you could kind of agree upon a mutual speed limit. But if your view is no, you're either open or you're closed, and if you're closed, you're a racist, then you're not going to have a debate. It's game over. So I think this is part of the other element which I talk about in the book, and that is that the left has shifted towards culture and has made sacralized identity groups. And once it's done that, anything that can be perceived as offensive to any member of any of these groups automatically becomes a transgression and can't be tolerated. And it's that kind of rigidity, I think, that is behind some of what we're seeing.
Yeah. In Matt Stoller's great book Goliath, he and other articles he's posted, he's a Democrat. He told the story of how Democratic strategists in the 60s deliberately targeted what we see as the rainbow flag today, at the expense of the white man. I don't know that it was even terribly economically oriented, but they definitely wanted to get the women and the gays and the blacks and the minorities, and they get them all together in a coalition. And we're seeing, that was a deliberate party strategy, and we're seeing the result of it now. But there's also been along the way an evolution and development in the philosophy, the political philosophy that underlies those decisions or informed them, however which way, where the issues on the left, whether they mean to or not, and I think some of them do, they're redefining the planes of meaning, right, of reality, right? So where you may have the like Aristotelian excellences and being the best political man and magnanimous man as a way to organize life 2,500 years ago, or you can have the Hobbesian, Jeffersonian, Madisonian perspective of life, liberty, property, and don't get killed and don't suffer a terrible death as being like the main fundamental planes of meaning for life. Then you've got, there's a few steps in between, but now you've got identity is the underlying meaning in a plane of meaning in the way to understand reality and the way to assess all truths as being accurate or not. So not only have these groups been sacralized, as you say, but now if you dispute their diversity mandate, then you're not only disagreeing with them politically, you're not only being a racist, but you're actually not even in tune with the reality, like actual reality of the world. And if you're not in touch with the reality of the world and you're a racist and I hate you politically, that's a really tough, if I were they and I believe that about somebody else, I would have a tough time negotiating with that person. That to them, that's as if you're negotiating with somebody who doesn't believe in gravity or who doesn't believe that the sun, is the center of our solar system or whatever the case may be. Do you see that in your work and your studies as well, or how do we get past that? Or I mean, oof.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I'd have to think more about that point about seeing reality differently. I mean, I certainly think the emphasis on the left shifted from this cultural turn away from class as the central category, the proletariat in Marxist terms, the working class, to a much narrower set of groups based around race, sexuality, and identity. And you see that in Herbert Marcuse in the mid 1960s, and some of the avatars of the new left who are really pivoting away from the working class, who they see as reactionary and no longer can be an agent of transformation. And that's kind of gradually, this kind of crystallizes into a very sort of religious. I mean, John McWhorter talks about the religion of anti-racism, where these groups become sacred totems. And so it might be indigenous, might be black, it might later, to a lesser degree, sexual minority groups such as LGBT and so on. And so anything, and of course, with this new narrative of trauma and emotional safety, all the psychotherapeutic lingo layered in on top. And so it's impossible then to have any kind of a discussion over something like immigration levels has got to be immediately triggering and traumatic to these sacred minority groups. And so you got to shut that down. And that whole attitude, I think, has sort of made it impossible to have critical discussions. But it's very animating as a religious system for progressives. I mean, this whole religious system about white male patriarchal oppressor versus the people of color as the oppressed, and the need to overthrow whether it be white privilege or patriarchy in a sort of it's a sort of what I call cultural socialism. It's taking the socialist impulse and transposing it to cultural categories, and that's sort of where we are. But it means that you have these this very religious approach to these groups. You can't really criticize or say anything that'll be seen as offensive, and I think that just seizes up the discourse, and it makes it impossible to resolve and to come to accommodations on, like, the speed of immigration, for example. And it has all these downstream effects. You can look at crime. The whole defund the police, I think, was an offshoot of the same motive. Like, here is a sacred group. Here is one case that's caught on video. And this is something that is almost religious in its reaction. So yeah, I think it's a force multiplier to the kind of polarization. Because even if we didn't have wokeness, even if that didn't exist, if you had this ethnic change, you would have two sides, one side wanting more, one side wanting less. I just don't think you'd have the same temperature of people accusing each other of being a racist, and that meaning social death and cancellation and all this sort of stuff. But because what's happened is not just the ethnic change and the immigration, but layered on top of that has been this shift in the ideology towards this sacralization of minority groups. That, combined with the demographic shifts, has led to an even more combustible situation. And it's not just the US. Right now in Canada has gone through, I'm from Canada. Canada's gone through in the last 5, 6, 7 years a process of polarization which is approaching the intensity, I think, of the American. Not quite as much, but a huge difference. There's now very little movement of voters between the parties, one election to the other. And even in Britain, the Brexit vote, I think, has had a certain effect. But it's not just people voting for Trump or for Brexit. It's now the reaction of people who are invested in this moral system of cultural socialism, who are then reacting against the people who voted for Trump, the people who voted for Brexit, Le Pen, or whatever. And so it's a ratcheting. As one reacts to the other reacts to, and that's sort of what we're living through.
Right. And then the accelerant of social media, right? So we have the use of what John Robb calls empathetic triggers in order to sort of expedite tribalization. We have online tribes, online political warfare happening. That's psychological. We distribute these videos and these clips in order to trigger an empathetic reaction in you that you don't even really have any control over. And based on your reaction to that video, you then get sorted and sorted and sorted and sorted and sorted. And I wish I was a little bit more of a historian on these phenomenon, so that I could temper my paranoia or my fear that this is a confluence of circumstances unparalleled in American history with the social media, look, it's just facts. Come on, with social media, with the change in the demographics. The impact of these psychological issues on our policy ideas and our political groupings. We've never seen these together because we've never had these phenomena together. So that in and of itself should be troubling. Those are just facts. I'm sure there's other examples we can come up with, things that were similar and related, but definitely not have we been in a post-65 heart seller, social media driven universe before. And then also with this evolution of the philosophical underpinning of what is life, based, it's identity, oppressor, oppressee, dynamic. And you just take that, as you said, cultural socialism, and you just apply that. It used to be just the workers. Now you apply it to every single group. And of course, there's only one person in the middle, one people with power. This is white, normative, whatever guy, regular American dudes at the middle of it. And if you dispute that, then you just don't see reality. Therefore, you're not a party that we can even negotiate with. What are you seeing happening in America and the West as a result of all of this? And where do you see it going in the future? What kind of trends can we see what's 5 years from now? What's 10, 15, 20 years from now in terms of actions, reactions, perhaps new political realignments, geographic realignments? What are you seeing happening as a result, and where are we going?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different paths. I think that if we take the English speaking countries, I think they're headed for greater and greater polarization, simply because I don't think, and I hate to come back to the progressive side, but I do think that that sacralization of identity, um, and the inability to sort of consider people who want slower cultural change to as a legitimate position, is simply going has just introduced a blockage in the system, and so you're just getting this ratcheting effect. Now, you can see in some other societies, like if you take Denmark, for example, some Scandinavian societies, Norway, the left has pivoted back towards class and towards saying, no, we're going to have control immigration. We're going to support this idea of the national identity. And the left has started doing better again because, of course, left wing parties across the West have been losing in unprecedented numbers in terms of the share that the established left wing party has won in places like Britain, France, the Netherlands. Is lowest it's been since the war in many cases. Now, of course, part of that's due to the rise of green parties, but still, I mean, a major reason is the defection of the working class, particularly the white working class. Now, in some Scandinavian countries, the left has actually said, no, we're going to do the economic left thing, but we're also going to be patriotic and we're going to control immigration. And those societies, I think, are going to be more stable. The societies where the left has stayed on the identitarian cultural socialist path, like U.S., Canada, Britain, so on, I think are going to see increasing polarization because the underlying problem hasn't been resolved. Now, I will say that when you have a pandemic and you have the first interstate war, this is Russia Ukraine, the first interstate war on European soil since World War II, those things will temporarily take attention a little bit away, suck some of the oxygen out of the cultural issues for the moment. But once the pandemic fades, and if there's a resolution on the Ukraine thing and the cost of living and the economic crisis in a way starts to resolve itself, then those cultural issues are going to be right back at us the way they were prior to the populist moment. So I think we're living through a somewhat unusual period, which actually is not favorable, not as favorable to populism. I think once the planes are flying and immigration is back, well, it already is in a way. Like we saw, if you look at the opinion surveys prior to the Brexit and Trump votes, people were becoming less and less concerned about the economy. After the 07-08 crash, the economy had recovered. People weren't thinking as much about that. And it's in that context that an issue like immigration can rise up people's priority list from issue number 8 to issue number 1 or 2. And that's when populism increases. So I think if I were to predict, I'd say in a few years' time, we're going to be back to where we were just prior to Trump and Brexit.
Hmm. And then what do the whites in America act as a group? Are they monolithic? Can you predict their behavior in terms of like relocating or being more politically active, or what do you see is currently happening? Not so much in like the political narratives or like what's
Right.
occupying people's mind spaces, but what are people doing literally as a reaction to this?
Well, yeah. So part of the book sort of talks about some of the residential trends, and one of those is essentially areas that have a relatively high white population share and are changing more slowly. Will tend to be more attractive, let's say, to whites who are settling down. And so areas, you're not going to get white growth generally in the outer boroughs of New York, for example. These are places that are already very diverse, or let's say the inland counties of Los Angeles. I mean, you're not going to get whites settling in those areas. They may have a legacy white population that gets older and older and slowly dwindles, but what you see is a similar pattern is that if you take places that increase population, it's the relatively white areas, particularly over 80%, that tend to have the fastest absolute white population growth, and it's the areas that are very diverse that tend to have a white population loss. So now, because the overall population is becoming less and less white over time, right? Because of that, it's still the case that the average white person is going to have more contact and live in neighborhoods with a higher share of minorities. But the relative mix, the deviation from the norm. So if your city went from 60% white to 40% white, the average white person is going to be living in a neighborhood that is deviating from that average by a similar amount or even a greater amount. So yeah, there is this sort of clustering that's happening at the residential level, and you see the same pattern in U.S., Canada, and Britain and Sweden. In terms of intermarriage and those sorts of patterns, I think there's sort of, as the population becomes more diverse mathematically, the number of interracial unions will increase as a proportion of the total, just mathematically, because of your choice of marriage partners, it's just going to be mathematically more likely that you could choose somebody who is going to be different. So that's sort of the trend there. However, even given that, it is the case that people are, there's a relatively high degree of ethnic endogamy. Now, in terms of the racial politics, though, I would say one of the things you've seen in the US is this, actually, which is one of the trends which is going against the polarization, is this sort of shift of racial minorities into the Republican Party in the last two election cycles. And that, I suppose you could see that as a positive because it's kind of cross-cutting some of the polarizing forces. However, what I would say is just because Hispanics are voting Republican doesn't mean that the issue of ethnic change is going to be less important. It may be less important for the Republicans getting into office, but the issues that people are talking about that are dividing the population are heavily connected to questions around race and ethnic change. It's just that those are embedded in ideologies. So it's your racial attitudes, your attitude to affirmative action, critical race theory, your attitude perhaps to the border. That kind of attitude will divide people politically, even if it's a Hispanic person who is saying, I want less immigration, I'm opposed to affirmative action, critical race theory. So it may be that it's a Hispanic or Black individual that's carrying these conservative racial attitudes, but the attitudes are still tied to your views on these topics, regardless of your own race. So I think that the actual racial divides might become less important, but divides on the basis of racial attitudes are going to remain extremely important.
That's a that's a very interesting point that you just made there. It's less actually about your practical relationship with racial relationships and more so about a conceptual understanding of how race impacts our society. I hear that right?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I also think there will continue to be, in the white population, this desire, and not just the white population, but the desire not to have ethnic change proceed so quickly is still a core motivation. Um, but it's just that, if we take, say, Hispanic and Asian voters, let's say, who are moving to Trump, from their perspective, they might say, well, I'm attached to this country called America. It had a certain ethnic mix, which I knew growing up. I kind of am used to that mix, that I actually want to actually see that mix not be, not change too rapidly. So you can actually get a non-white person, paradoxically, want the ethnic mix not to change so quickly as well.
Yeah.
And this is sort of a tricky thing for some people to understand, but that's part. So it's still about, this question of diversity and ethnic change is still important, even as you're getting non-whites moving towards the Republicans.
Right. This is a great lead up to one of my next questions here. You paint a picture, right? An East Asian immigrant who comes to the United States because the United States is what it is, gets here, wants the United States to be what it was when they made the decision to come here, because that's it's part of the defining element of their life story, is their
Right.
motivation behind this major change that they made. And I've had this conversation before about civic nationalism, mythology, stories, what really makes up the nation in and of itself. And and I'd love to hear your opinions on all of these. Personally, I think that one of the reasons that there's such a backlash to the diversity change element is that they're not only changing the demographics or pushing for that or saying it's a good thing, but it's the concomitant destruction of the mythology that's painful, and the tearing down of statues, and the going back and changing the narratives about certain of the founders or of our prominent politicians or of just basically everything. um I'm speculating here, and I don't have a 100% lockdown position on this, but I would suspect that the blow of the changing demographics would be softened if those who made up the change of the demographics also said, I love George Washington, Johnny Appleseed, Babe Ruth, and love American history, and love the mythologies, and love all the stories, and love all of our, you know, organizing principles of our spirit. And I don't want to change that. I just want to participate in that. But that's not what we're getting. We're getting the complete, not complete, but a seemingly systematic approach to destroying the myths and the founding myths of America. 1619, people tearing down friggin' Thomas Jefferson statues. Like, what do you make of the role of myth and nationalism and civic nationalism? I've often cited John Jay, I believe, in Federalist #2, where he just goes on about how Americans are bestowed by a common heritage, genetics, ancestry, blood, language, culture, war, experience, history, all this to make a great nation. That was how they saw it at the founding. And
Well, yeah, yeah.
yeah, go ahead. I mean,
Well,
yeah.
well, yeah. I mean, I think you make a really good point. Was that if you take, let's say, American national identity, there's always been two traditions which have coexisted. You've had the universalist tradition, the idea of it's a beacon on a hill or a city on a hill, and it's people from all over. Um, this is I think Krev Kerr, this idea of American as a new man. But at the same time, there was always that implicit, more ethnocultural idea of the United States as, initially a white Protestant, Anglo-Protestant country. I mean, you in the book, I talk about how Jefferson and a number of the other founders saw the Americans as descendants of the Anglo-Saxons escaping the Norman conquest, which they believed actually to be descendants of this.
Yes.
And these two things actually both have actually helped constitute national identity, even though the universalist one has been articulated more explicitly. The other has also been there. You read Teddy Roosevelt's Winning of the West. A lot of American historians in the 19th century were talking about these sorts of sort of ethnic origins as being important for the United States. Now, I think there's a difference between ethno-nationalism, which says in order to be an American, you must be a WASP or white or whatever. And if you're not that, you're not a real American. That is, I think, rightly criticized as exclusionary. But on the other hand, there is what I call ethno-traditional nationalism, which says, well, there's a mix. You've got minorities, you have a majority group that's, it's maybe changed a little bit, but that's sort of the mix we have. And that's part of the national identity we would like to, that's important to us, and we don't want it to change too quickly. And we, if immigrants come in, we'd like them to melt into this, not just adopt the civic values, but eventually melt into the sort of melting pot, which is more of an ethnic majority. And I think that sort of second conception, which I'd call ethno-traditional, is not the same. It's often, again, critics will often say that's the same thing as essentially racist, nativist, ethnic nationalism, but it's not. Ethnic nationalism actually says you must be a member of the ethnic majority to be an equal member of the nation. And if you're not, if you're outside that, you're second class. Whereas the ethno-traditional conception can be held by someone of any race, and it just says, well, ethnic composition is part of, not, it's part of what makes the country distinctive. And what I'm attached to, it could change a little bit, but we would like to see some assimilation and I think that second is sort of where I'd come down. And so this is why we get into questions around speed of change. How quickly can we change, have immigration in order? Is that going to overwhelm the processes of assimilation, which may take a few generations, for example. Um, but yeah, I think that ascriptive kind of, it's like a bit like landscape and sports and food and all these things, which again are not part of the American creed. They're not necessarily written down on paper, but yet they're very important for people's national identity. What it means to be American, it could be baseball, it could be a Ford truck or something. What scholars would call everyday symbols of nationalism, of which ethnic composition is one. But these are important things, right? And I think I agree with you that if you've got major shifting in some of these everyday symbols, and at the same time you're trashing the established mythology, then yeah, you're going to have that's just a recipe for division and polarization. I think what's happening now is, of course, the right for a long time wasn't concerned about culture except for religion. It was mainly about foreign policy and the economy, low tax. Now that the right is shifting onto the same battlefield, as it's become more interested in culture. Now we're seeing that the left, which has been interested in culture for decades and has largely carried the culture, is now being resisted more and more. And so this is one of the reasons we're seeing a rising temperature, I think.
Yeah. The you said the word assimilation. Part of the party platform on the left seems to be making the word assimilation a bad thing. Right. Like if I remember I was pilloried many years ago for just saying we should embark on a national program of assimilation. But like, that's the most fascist authoritarian thing I ever heard in my life. And I don't know if it is or isn't, but it seems to me that in order to facilitate the unity that you described that would become as a result of the cultural ethno-traditionalism, I guess I'm not using the right phrase exactly there, but if you can mash all those words together, I think you said it better than I did before. Then you need to have active assimilation. You need to have a plan for assimilation, and I think that now has become a bad word. I want to try to combine a bunch of issues into a question for you. If we're Where does the psychological distribution come from? We've very easily discussed that there's different psychological makeup, and that makes you predisposed to viewing order or disorder certain ways, conscientious, lack of conscientiousness, etc., which then predicts the way that you respond to political issues. Where do those come from? Are they equally distributed among races? Are some races, man, we're gonna get fired. We're all getting canceled now for this conversation right here. But I think that there's an interesting scientific discussion to be had here if we're very, I think, uncontroversially accepting the fact that there's a difference in psychological makeup. Is there a difference in psychological makeup in people that come from different countries, different cultures, different races? Whereas if they come into the country and enter into the milieu, that we're guaranteed to have some sort of tinderbox of explosions. I have no idea the answers on this. I realize it's probably sketchy, question to throw out there. But I'm really curious to see how all these things work together, because, man, we got to find a way to work together here in the United States, because right now all signals to me are red, flashing red, polarized, separation, major issues, no breaks on either side, things only getting deepening and furthering away from each other. And without having tough conversations, we're not going to find a way to reach what I would think is a point at which we can, rally around the mythology of America and celebrate that, and, go forward under a united banner here. So I throw this question out to you. Feel free to punt.
Well, I think in terms of the psychological makeup, I'm not sure that differs much from place to place. In fact, in a way, psychologists would almost need to see cross-cultural universals as evidence that there's something going on that's just at a deeper biological genetic level, right? That's driving the psychology. I think there's probably not a difference there between parts of the world. But of course, how the environments are different and how that interacts then with the the psychology is important. So some of these dispositions I talk about are about half, a third to a half heritable. In twin studies, you can see that. So there's a very strong heritable component. Some have argued even as high as sort of 75% heritable. I don't think that's the case, but still. So we've got that strong heritable thing, and that's there in the population. You're not going to teach that out of people. Right. So this is one of the points that Stenner makes. So there are ways you can actually work with it. If the left was saying, well, we have immigrants, but, they're assimilating and they're becoming like you, that would be actually regardless of whether that's a true statement or not, that would be a much more positive thing for someone who likes order than to say, society's getting more and more diverse and it's changing faster and faster. That is exactly the wrong thing. It's going to elicit a backlash. So part of this problem is, though, because the left has shifted into this cultural socialism, it is sort of very much committed to this program, the intellectual university-based kind of left. Now, I think one possibility going forward is that it could be the case that one of the things about the culture war is the attitudes on a lot of these things, like critical race theory and history, for example, and cancel culture. The public is sort of against them about 2-1. So, I'm trying to think: is America a racist society? Should that be taught to children in school? Be taught they're living on stolen land? These are all survey questions I've seen the results of, and you are not going to find. You're going to find at least a 2-1 slant against those sorts of positions. And what I'd say the Republican politicians in the United States are kind of twigging onto post Chris Rufo is that actually this is a very good wedge issue, because if you look at the public opinion amongst Democrats, these issues fragment and split opinion on the left, and they unite and mobilize opinion on the right. So they're an obvious issue to go after. Now, I think what could happen is if the Republicans are able to exploit that issue and flip Democrat voters, then that's going to empower this more centrist, sane wing of the Democrats, and people like Matthew Iglesias, for example, James Carville, and others, to sort of say, we got to get off the woke train, and this is killing us. And eventually, if that's the case, then we might be able to see a return to a more normal kind of national, a more patriotic kind of Democratic Party that starts to be able to sideline cultural socialism a little more. And then I think that could start to steer the ship back a bit more towards the center. Now, it's not going to cure things instantaneously because the cultural institutions are very much captured by these ideologies. But hopefully over time, maybe the government can start to, I think, intervene in these cultural institutions to reform them. Here in Britain, for example, the government has instituted a higher education reform bill that will empower. Basically, universities have to uphold academic freedom, and if they don't, they can be fined. And essentially, there's a new office that will be able to tell them to rewrite policies. And so there's a whole bunch of, I think, things governments can do to actually introduce a little more kind of centrism into these elite institutions. So that is a sort of hopeful future, I think, but there's a lot of ifs in that.
There
right
are.
Now,
There are. The institutional capture is one of the things that gives me, takes away any real hope that I have for the future, in the sense that it took them 50 years to go from the ground up all the way through to the boards, and now they've got it. It's going to take more than just a couple of years of the left being like, maybe we shouldn't be so woke, for that to wring itself out of every stupid institution in America, from your schools to your, sports teams, to your universities, to your media outlets, to basically everything, everywhere you go, to your local pub, to whomever. Right, it's
right.
everywhere. It's everywhere. That took them a long time to achieve, and I think it will take some time for it to be resolved. And I don't really know exactly how that's going to go. But this seems like I mean, I've always said, and I wrote this in my book, Democrats are deplorable, which I wrote in like 2018. It's crazy to think how long ago it was now. That this intersectionality, critical Marxist crap, it's a self-defeating paradigm that just ends up with one person in the middle pointing its finger at everybody else, which is on the other side of their ever tightening cordon around them. And there's a natural finish to it, but I, you know, technology is accelerating at such a pace that the big concern really is that the mediating technologies that arrange our society, that dictate the way that we interact and we communicate, we transmit money, we purchase goods, that our data gets bought, sold, transferred, processed, and whatnot. Social institutions are made and things, that those mediating technologies will be infused with this woke ideology in a way that will make it very difficult to dislodge them from society, and that there's a collapsing window of opportunity because the technology is on its way. It's already happening. We can see this. And if they can master the technology that mediates our culture and our whole society and our relationships from person to person, and infuse it with the woke ideology, well, that's a really tough thing, if not impossible, to dislodge. So, John Robin, people call it the long night. It's possible. If you're a Chinese dissident, I think that you can see this argument pretty clearly here, that if the technology is infused with the ideology and that technology mediates your society, you don't really have much room to dissent and you don't have much room to push for change, etc. So that's our fear, or my fear. Absent
That's interesting.
absent that. Oh yeah, go ahead, sure.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that is a real, genuine fear, which has a lot of basis in reality, and you can see it the way in which Trudeau in Canada used the sort of freezing of bank accounts on the trucker protest, for example. I think that's absolutely right. What I would say, however, is unlike in China, I think that elections and federal government or state government is still a place in which the people can have an impact. And I actually think that the conservative side or classical liberal side needs to be think more creatively about policy solutions to this. So I think, for example, if you made political belief a protected characteristic, you could go after, which it is, by the way, in Europe and in Britain now increasingly, you could then start to go after companies for political discrimination on their algorithms, for example. And also, I think you could do a lot more regulatory things on freedom of speech protection as well, so that people couldn't be fired for speech. I think all of those things are possible, but they're going to require governments to intervene in the operations of these institutions, which I think is starting to happen. And you can actually get change pretty quickly. Some of the organizations pushing, for example, gender self identification in major organizations in Britain have been largely expelled. So the Stonewall, which is a charity, I mean, and very quickly. So I actually think you can get these, or with critical race theory in schools can be banned. So I think with a lot of these things, actually, with intelligent government action, a lot of them can be removed from these institutions. But it's going to take a sort of a well rehearsed and well thought out plan from an elected government to do that. But so I don't think all hope is lost.
Well, I was hopeful until you said well thought out and executed plan from the government there. But I can see where you would get some sense of optimism. I mean, Rufo has had some success. There's no question. There's no question about that. And he finds the right issues, and you can hammer these things home. I think part of the appeal of DeSantis to people is that he seems ready and able, and perhaps competently able, to utilize the government to affect the social and cultural change that he wishes to see upon the world, which is a different approach than libertarian approach, hands-off kind of approach. Let's let the markets take care of this approach. And, it's going to be interesting to see how the tent on the right responds to that type of action. Sometimes I have mixed feelings about it myself when I see, legislative changes or tax changes or other things based on social political or social cultural activities of the corporations. There's a fear that it gets just normalized and then turned around and used. But then again, hey, it's already being used on the left. So hey, there's a lot of arguments to be made there. But we could talk about a lot of this stuff for a long time. I want to transition hardy har into the question of the day from your most recent work, which basically shows that we're all going to be gay in just a matter of years. Is that right, Eric? Are we all going to be gay, sir?
Well, actually shows the opposite. Because I think you're right. You're sort of paraphrasing Bill Maher when he sort of, there've been a number of surveys that, so particularly the Gallup surveys that showed the share of young Americans sort of under 25 and under who identify as LGBT has tripled in the last 10 years. It's reached 21%. And projecting forward as Marr does, he said, well, we'll all be gay in 2054. So but no, I guess part of my report is to say, actually, these numbers are, the actual number is a lot lower than what appears on the tin, because the General Social Survey, which looks at US, asks people about not just how they identify, but their sex partners, how many of them, what their gender is. And what you can see pretty clearly is a big increasing divergence between sexual behavior and sexual identity. So the LGBT behavior has only increased. It's increased about 4 points in that youngest group sort of in the last, say, 15 years. And the identification's increased 11 points. So the identification has really taken off. Now, the other thing is, if you look, for example, at female, the biggest growth category is bisexuality, particularly amongst women. If you look at female bisexuals, in this survey, fewer than 1 in 5 back in 2008 or 2010 said that they only had male partners. That is, they were behaving in a conventional way, heterosexual way. That share's now approaching 6 in 10. And so you've now got most of these female bisexuals who are essentially straight in their behavior, but they're identifying as bisexual. So a lot of this growth is really about people who are identifying without actually doing. The actual increase in the number of people who are behaving in a same-sex way is actually pretty small. And I think by the time it gets through the life course, that's going to amount to almost nothing in terms of a change. So that's the first thing. However, more serious is, I think, this link to mental health.
Can we? I want
Yeah.
to talk specifically about the
Yeah.
mental health, the causation, and et cetera, and all that. But I just want to drill down on this part, just to make it clear.
Yeah.
In your extensive research that you have done, using broad general surveys, both in the United States and in England, Western Europe,
Yeah. Britain. Yeah.
your analysis leads you to believe that while the headlines say there's a wild increase in LGBTQ-ism, for lack of a better word, in the Western space, that what you are seeing upon greater research is that there's a divergence between identity and activity, and that the identity has grown tremendously, but that the actual LGBTQ behavior hasn't changed dramatically.
Right. And yeah. And what's happened is that the rise in LGBT identity, particularly the people who identify without the behavior, that's really heavily concentrated in the most liberal fifth of the young population. So being very liberal, the share of LGBT identifiers has gone from, I think, something like 11% in 2008 amongst the very liberal to 34%, a third. Whereas amongst the other groups, slight liberal, moderate, conservative, it's not moved very much, moved only a few points. And so one big part of this story is this is very much about a liberal or very liberal kind of movement and ecosystem.
I'll say it. It's just young white chicks. It's young, affluent white chicks who are getting, are buying up as an identity rather than putting it into becoming like an actual lesbian.
Largely, except I would qualify those first words in the sense that non-white
Hmm.
and not affluent are as likely to
Okay.
be LGBT. It is so it's not now there is some truth to what you say, and that the affluent white university educated types who are very political, for example, someone who believes in shouting down speakers who are offensive is very much more likely to be LGBT, or who's taking gender studies or racial studies. But for the sort of non-white, non-university educated population, we also see a substantial rise. So I think part of that is really more a general cultural shift, that being different is somewhat interesting, and not being boring old, straight. So I think that's playing a role here, particularly on the female side.
What about the divergence between the, is there a demographic relationship between the identifier but not the behavior? The person who
Um,
says I'm gay or bi but doesn't act upon it, is that equally distributed across the racial demographics?
I don't know about the racial demographic. I didn't look at that specifically, actually. I mean, the numbers might not be large enough on the non-whites in the survey to do that. What I can say, however, is that the people who identify but don't behave are the ones who are vastly more likely to be liberal. Whereas the people who behave, who have LGBT behavior, same sex partners, their political profile is not as different from the rest of the population. So there's something about the act of identifying rather than the behavior. And of course, that doesn't sit very well with the argument that says it's all about discrimination. The reason people are liberal is because they feel discriminated against. The problem with that argument is the people who are engaging in same-sex behavior are going to be much more visible on the street, much more likely to be the target of discrimination, and yet they are less likely to be liberal than the ones who aren't behaving that way. So, in a way, the discrimination argument doesn't really work, I think, on this. Um, I think what's going on is there's something about being very liberal, that culture, which is more encouraging of people to identify as LGBT, that encourages them not to identify as straight, because straight is seen as, in some ways, part of the system. And so I do think that's part of what's going on.
It is indeed part of the system that
Yeah,
creates society that has families and babies and makes a future for the world. So, yeah,
right.
it's definitely part of the system. I mean, it is by definition the system. And in that regard, those people have correctly identified that heteronormative, cis, straight, gendered folks doing the normal thing is the normal thing by which all are
Right.
judged. Yeah, exactly. So I have long been aware and talked about and argued that being queer is a state of mind that relates to the blurring of boundaries and can be political as well as sexual. And so the LGBTQ folks have allies in straight people who wish to, because of the planes of identity being being the plane of meaning for reality and understanding your whole philosophical universe, one wants to queer identity groups as a way to eliminate oppression. And I mean, this is, I'm steel manning their argument
Yeah.
here, as a way to eliminate oppression. And so therefore to queer something is to be a verb, and one can be queer without being homosexual. And in being queer, then you're advancing your political agenda, which is a philosophical agenda, which is to smear these lines of meaning of identity and such. And so your research confirms this, right? That straight, or at least non-gay acting folks identifying as gay, and it correlates very clearly with being, quote, very liberal, which we know is the home of the woke, which is all the stuff we've been talking about. So the data backs us up now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the correlation between LGBT identity and political, where you are on a sort of very liberal to very conservative scale, is very strong. Um, and it's not the case. I mean, of course, it's the case that if you are LGBT, you're more likely to vote Democrat and be liberal. But one of the interesting things, again, is this idea of people who are not behaving in an LGBT way, but are identifying in an LGBT way, particularly on the female side, are more likely to be liberal than women who are behaving with a same-sex partner who is also a woman. And so I think that's telling you that the line of causation is coming, I think, from the ideology to the sexuality in that case. Less so for men, but certainly on the female side, which is a much higher share of the LGBT population.
Let's tie it together now with mental health.
Okay.
So, what did your research find in terms of the relationship between mental health, political leaning, and LGBTQ identification?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important set of relationships because the recent work by Derek Thompson, who appeared in the Atlantic Monthly a little while ago, shows that amongst American teens, three quarters, fully 3 in 4 LGBT identifying teens are saying they are sad or hopeless all or most of the time. So depression, anxiety is extremely high. In my survey work, I find sort of 2 to 3 times higher depression and anxiety amongst LGBT compared to uh, heterosexual. Now, that's one set of relationships. Another set of relationships is that people who identify as very liberal are also more likely to report mental health problems, depression and anxiety, than people who are in the center, even slight liberals, center conservative. The very liberals have sort of something like twice as many of these mental health problems as people from the center conservative. Um, Now, is there a relationship here? I think there is a relationship here because the way I would see it is that it's the culture that we're in, particularly the left liberal culture in elite circles, but generally, this culture is encouraging boundary transgression, and it's that can be destabilizing for people when the existing identities and boundaries are problematized, and it makes the world a more confusing place. And I think there you're seeing that it's problematizing sexual boundaries. It's also problematizing the boundary between the interior mind and the exterior reality, for example. And so I think there was a piece by Boston University or Boston University professor Leah Greenfeld who argues that the more of this equality and uncertainty there is in the culture, the higher the rate of mental illness through history. And also, it's one of the reasons why East Asia, which has a more ordered society, doesn't have as many, doesn't have as high a rate of anxiety and depression as Western countries. And so I think the fact our culture is pushing in this kind of boundary transgression direction has led to more kind of what's called anime, a kind of state which produces more anxiety, and it also produces more fluidity on the sexual side too. So I think these things are all related to the culture, which is kind of the common denominator. And if you actually look at these three questions: political ideology, LGBT identity, and mental, anxiety and depression indicators. Those things overlap immensely. Sort of one underlying variable explains half of the variation in those three separate, what are seen as quite separate things: ideology, sexuality, mental illness, and yet they're so tightly connected in the data. So yeah, that's how. And I don't think the explanation that's sometimes given on the progressive side is that, well, it's because LGBT people are subject to discrimination, and that's why they have more mental health problems. I mean, no doubt there's some truth in that. However, we've been having an increasingly tolerant culture over the last sort of decade or two, in which time the mental health issues amongst LGBT populations have actually become worse than the mental health issue in the straight population. So the kind of correlation doesn't really work with that account. And I think instead, the account that sort of makes more sense is the one I've articulated, which is that this culture of transgression and destructuring has just become more entrenched amongst young people, and that sort of destabilized both the sexuality and the mental illness more.
Indeed. There's a lot of data out there that contradicts some of the most pervasive leftist narratives, as, for example, the rate of interracial marriage or acceptance of interracial marriage in America is like the highest it's ever been. And yet, at the same time, the left will tell you that we're like, racism is increasing and off the charts. This too here, the data around increasingly tolerant society, yet at the same time, the rate of mental illness of people that are both very liberal and who identify LGBTQ going up tremendously. There's questions maybe to be had about the causality. Does this very left liberal ideology just attract people who are already feeling a sense of anxiety and depression and are finding some sense of identity or home or solace in this very liberal left ideology and the queering elements? Or is that what's causing the mental health issues? I mean, any discussion about mental health that doesn't also include social media seems to be incomplete, especially among, let's say, just young white chicks. I'll say it.
Right.
And so there's a real conversation to be had about all of those things. I think there's also the conversation to be had that I think, in the old days, you'd have like punks and goths and hippies and weirdos and this and that. And now you've just got like gay and trans guys, as like a dissident group within like a young person's social milieu. At least on my very anecdotal observations of kids in high school and talking to my kids and listening to them about their friends and stuff. But I've also long argued that our society is at one, tailoring itself to the least mentally stable, least attached, least committed elements of our society, which seem to be young single women who don't have any families and don't have any kids and aren't attached to our cultural traditions and think that cis-het white men are the problem and all this. We're responding to their whims and their fancies as a nation, like hardcore in a way that seems to perhaps be unweighted to their actual prevalence within society. How does this play out, this political division and the gay and the thing? Or do we just start realizing and start using language on the right that look, they've got a flag. So it's really like a political thing at this point. And so as you fly a flag, they're going to attract people that adhere to the flag that may or may not be part of the actual sexual practice. Is this a change in the narrative or just words that people have to use on the right? And then I also want to just throw out there too, and you can respond or not. I guess this maybe grooming thing isn't a real thing, right? Like, I think that there's a real big push out there right now to say that our cultural apparatus is making people gay, which could be destabilizing for society and ruining the families and blah, 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 and all the things we've always talked about. But in fact, it may not actually be making people gay. It may just be making people politically queer, which is a nuance that I don't know if people are ready to start really talking about.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think it's actually leading to a lot more LGBT behavior. I suspect this is going to be not really a big issue going forward in the sense that longer term as these people go through the life course, because not only is the behavior increase much more muted than the identity increase, but I haven't even mentioned the fact that where we have census data as opposed to survey data, the census data shows sort of levels that are a half or a third as high anyway amongst the young people of LGBT identification. So, yeah, I guess my take, and the other thing on the grooming side is that the data that I look at on homeschool, parochial like Catholic school versus private and public doesn't show much difference. I'm just not convinced the school is having that much effect on actual sexual behavior, actually. So I think that's maybe, whereas I think the critical race theory stuff is much more, a much clearer case of where intervention is necessary. Whereas I think some of the sexual grooming stuff, I think, is a bit of a distraction. I'm not sure it matters as much as people think. But that would be my takeaway from the data I've seen. I don't see this, and something like the trans thing has actually the numbers that I've seen would suggest that that's peaked. The last year's numbers seem to show that that's gone down. So I think once it starts to go down, I think some of the kind of cultural contagion effect will start to sort of fade a little bit too. So yeah, I guess it's not something that I'm particularly concerned about going forward.
Man, are we going to look back on this as and throw it in there with like the great Satan scare and this and that and like rock and roll? Rock and roll makes you do crazy, and you know, Call of Duty is going to make you go out there and kill people. All just sort of generalized scares about things. There's an old phrase in weightlifting, like everybody wants to be a bodybuilder, but nobody wants to lift any weights. And
Right.
you can make this analogy to the homosexual lifestyle as well too. I mean, it's easy to talk about. It's easy to fly the flag, especially in high school and in college and young adulthood. But when it comes down to it, I mean, you
Right.
you get where the rubber meets the road here
Right.
is where and this phenomenon hasn't really been going on long enough for the early participants to age into that time of life where it's like, okay, like
Yeah.
are we playing in the streets now, or am I really like picking my life partner and settling down and deciding about whether to have kids and all that stuff? So
Yeah.
fascinating, absolutely fascinating conversation, Eric. I really appreciate your time and energy. I have a million more issues that we could talk about. Didn't even get to half my questions. I love the research that you've done. I love the I'm not gonna say dispassionate, but you bring in real analysis to these questions that are really, really emotionally charged. And I find that to be very valuable, and I appreciate it greatly. This book, everybody, you should go out and get it, White Shift by Eric Kaufmann. Also go to his Twitter account. I've got it right here. Oops, wrong button. We've got it right here. Merge. Oh, it's not going. There we
It's
go.
just
Got it
at.
right.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there we go. At EPKAUFM. And follow him, please, there on Twitter. Anything that you'd like to say in conclusion? Anything you want to draw people to?
Not really, Jack. I mean, just to say thanks so much for having me on, and it's been a really interesting conversation. Great questions, and I hope people get a lot out of it.
Yeah, fantastic. I certainly did. I know people will. These are all questions of the day and really important and things that need to be thought about in a way that uses data and uses reality rather and I just got to say personally, I'm getting frustrated a little bit with the hyped up mania that I'm seeing in some areas of my social media network, and I just wanted to have real honest conversations about things. So I think this will really help. So Eric, thank you very much. Thanks very much for coming on. Thank you everybody for listening. I am Jack Murphy, and this is the Jack Murphy Live Show. And if you are interested in what we're talking about here and want to be in a group of people that are interested in these issues and want to figure out how to put the best path forward for ourselves, our families, and our communities, check out the Liminal Order. It is an all-male, national, even international sort of fraternity of men who share common values and want to be reproductive people with their family, their community, and their nation. That's liminal-order.com. Check it out. Subscribe to the podcast. Subscribe on YouTube. Hit subscribe on your podcast app. Follow me on Twitter at Jack Murphy Live. And until the next time, we are out.